1, 2, 3, 4.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
I was just talking about problems, gentlemen, as you come into the conversation. And if you were tuned in yesterday, you saw many different places. This stuff is complicated, and whether it's stormwater, as Robin was just talking about, or other things, you know, we can't have a generation of project failure. It's going to be bad news. Like Tesla, it might be the safest car on the road, but we have a shiny object problem, and every one of these is probably, you know, fodder for local coverage. And so we want to do it right, just for good reasons, but to avoid the downsides too. And you guys can help us do that. We've got a really terrific and kind of diverse lineup, even though we've got 2 lawyers. Lawyers know that we're all specialists now. So we've got a local dirt lawyer, which you always need. And I learned that at BP when we were doing deals across the country. We always had to partner up with local counsel. We've got Mr. Charles Howland, who some of you may remember, or some of you may know, is a legend at EPA, has done a lot of work kind of at the federal level, and he knows a lot of things about a lot of things, including dirt, but Superfund is a specialty of his, but also he knows a lot about electricity, FERC, and other things. And then last, but certainly not least, and Brownfielders know him as well, Mr. Chris Alviggi. He's a legend. He can really make deals work, and I've never really seen anyone explain the sophisticated stuff, package it with insurance, and make it very, very plain and simple like Chris does. So Chris is going to anchor us today, but we're going to start with some dynamite presentations. Again, building on what Robin was just doing, really getting down to it and talking about, you know, what are the bullets that we need to be thinking about as we proceed down these project pathways. So I've talked enough to try to tee us up, and thank you, gentlemen, we've stolen some of your time, but I want to remind everybody we'll have a soft break, I think at 10 to the hour, that we'll roll through for bonus questions and time with you guys. With that being said, Mr. Mark Bergoffen, are you there?
I am. Good morning.
Good morning. You sound great. I hear Chris and Charlie. How are you this morning?
We're good. We're good.
Awesome. Awesome. So, who wants to go first?
I realize we didn't quite figure this out.
I always defer to counsel.
I know who's going last, but Mark, I think, are we going to start with you?
I think that was the plan. I would be glad to go first, or Mark. Either one would work.
I'm fine. And Charlie, if you want to take it, that's great.
Okay, give me a hard stop. What's my hard stop time? And give me, I've already lost time. Just tell me that much.
I'll give you, let's say, I don't know. See, we're really in the deal room, folks. Let's give you 13 minutes, Charlie.
Okay.
Can you go to 20?
So, hey,
20
folks,
yeah.
I'm Charlie Howland, 28 years at EPA. In some ways, in terms of time spent, the smallest piece on repowering, but in terms of personal satisfaction, it was the greatest. Wait, let me share my screen. You got to be able to see me. Let's see.
And this is a working session. This is how we do things. I'm a retired attorney, happily retired. But dump your questions in the chat. We may not be able to get to them all, and I want to remind everybody too that we're coming back for the biggest expert session of the entire summit at the end of the day with a big bank of experts, and we're going to answer everything that we don't answer today, and a lot of other questions are going to come up as we dial into the 300 level. And look at that beautiful slide, Charlie.
Good. So actually, this one on the right is one I actually worked on at EPA. It was an easy one. It was DuPont putting its own panels on its own landfill. So financing was not an issue. What I'm going to do today, and I actually did some juggling right at the very end, because I'm also going to be on that last panel, I'm going A, and B, because some of what I normally cover has been covered really well early in the conference. I'm going to power through some stuff to get to the PPA deal-making piece. So bear with me. It's all part of the slide deck, and let's just boogie. Let me go down here. So next 4 or 5 slides, I guess sort of capture them verbally. Don't be afraid of brownfields, solar developers. Don't be afraid whether it's a brownfield as EPA defines it, which is a term of art which excludes Superfund and RCRA corrective action, the scary sites. But for my purposes today, brownfields include everything, from that site that maybe had an underground storage tank to the methyl ethyl death manufacturing company that in fact is ready for redevelopment. All of those can be great for bright fields. I think Laura and a few others sort of covered the issues that are in this slide yesterday pretty well. There are drivers and there are impediments from a policy point of view on these. Let's see. So there's a lot of these sites out there, you know, especially when I define my universe broadly to include both the unused landfill and the 50 acres on the back of that existing manufacturing site that could be behind the meter. So the sites we're talking about can be in front of the meter or behind the meter. And that has a distinction that we've talked about a little bit so far. We've already talked about advantages. Let me just sort of jump to a couple ones to really highlight. And I'll probably close the conference with this. Many communities that would not really be that eager for a solar farm to take over Farmer Brown's farm, losing some of the agricultural feel of the community, potentially depending on the state or the locality, losing tax revenue, they'd rather see the farm field become mixed use or even a Walmart. But if it's no landfill, environmentally impaired, that's a sweet spot. I think we've already covered this. This slide you've seen a few times. I just want to highlight one thing that was mentioned before on top of everything else, that, you know, you're selling a product with one of these sites. The product is electricity. Got to get the electricity to market. To get to market, you need a wire. Okay, you'd be surprised if you're new to this, how sometimes the electrical connection to the grid, or at least the right of way to get to the grid, whether it's the distribution line or the transmission line. Josh talked a little bit about this yesterday. I think most of these sites practically are going to be connecting to the distribution line. They need that legal right of way. Often that brownfield can offer that. Okay, project financing. Now let me slow down a little bit. Big picture. This will be new to some of you and old hat to others. Let me just say it's a very complicated arena. There are multiple ways to structure these deals. They will typically depend on tax implications and whether or not, and who's buying the power and where it's located. So I'll just highlight with that. Really, I'm going to touch, in fact, let me just power through all these. I'm going to touch on some of these briefly. I'm going to count on Mark for some of the land control issues. I added at the very end some liability slides, but I'm going to focus for the rest of my time really on project structure. So let me just get to it. So what is project financing? It's basically when you're using other people's money to build something, other people that you're borrowing from, other people that you're taking investment from. In the solar world, especially, those investors are quite likely to be tax equity investors, people who want to take advantage of what I think today is still 26% investment tax credit. So you're setting up a structure, and good, I'm talking now about a specific type of deal. I'm talking about typically either in front of or behind a meter, but where someone else is supplying the capital. If you're building it yourself, many of these issues are, you know, you're building it off your balance sheet. But typically you're using someone else's capital. And it relies on the cash flow from the things that you're selling from your project to feed those people who lent you money and who invested in your project. As a practical matter, and you're seeing this a lot more these days, really big capital is interested in these projects, but typically on a portfolio basis. They want to put together a number of projects to sort of allocate the risk of any one of them not happening. And it's attractive to big companies also. So there's investment companies who are interested in this as a business, but also companies who want to build for themselves, but build it off of their own balance sheet. And this project financing in the solar space really took off in the 70s and the 80s. Quick highlight here. There are practically 3 different, maybe 4 different sweet spots where, based on a number of factors, including the nature of your interconnection agreement, what Josh talked about yesterday, the nature of how big a site you can put on a distribution grid. As a practical matter, these are sort of sweet spots such that project developers are typically looking to build right at or a little bit below these sweet spots. And I'll stop with that. You know, that's a deeper conversation, but here are the reasons why that is. It's important to understand that you've got several things to sell with one of these projects if it's big enough. not just the energy, but also capacity promised to be available in the future. That's an increasing issue that is supporting solar projects, and some other services. I should have mentioned I 28 years at EPA, now in private practice at Curtis. One of my major clients is a company called Customized Energy Solutions. Shout out to them. They are in the business of making these projects work all over the country and in Japan and India. But one of the things I've come to learn is solar with battery can be a very important source of ancillary services in PJM, in the ISOs, and that's part of your bundle of sticks. Okay, this is an important slide. You don't have to read it. The concept here is that at different points in the process timeline of your project, there's going to be different risk-benefit attributes, so strong that very often there are different people playing in each world. The developer taking a lot of risk, got to hire Mark, got to make Mark happy, got to talk to Chris about insurance, but that's where nothing's in the ground yet. Okay, high risk, relative low cost. Then you get to the second phase. That's where, okay, I've got all my permits in place. I can now prove to my financing partners that I have a real project. And so the second phase is putting together the financing. And then finally, once I get it built, once I get to the commercial operation date, I've interconnected, there might be someone else now who wants no risk, just steady return of money. It's also right at the end of phase 2, when I have a real project that's going to get built. That's when tax equity comes in. Tax equity doesn't want to come in at the first stage. Who knows? Maybe it's never going to get built. Tax equity coming in right at the very end there. This slide just sort of captures all the different sort of types of risk and benefits that come off these sites. This was actually done. This was done by the Department of Treasury for international projects across the world. The same fundamental issues apply here. Typical elements, let me just spin through this really quickly. You've got different players, okay, functionally. Sometime if the project is small enough, or depending on the financing, one entity may in fact play more than one of these roles, but you've got different sort of roles. And again, the concept here is to have a special purpose entity that takes in funds, throws those funds off to different people, whether they're debt or equity, and you've got the project sponsor insulating itself from liability. Let's see, anything else I want to add here? We've already touched on this, but a key part of project financing for the bigger sites is a PPA. Now, Virginia is still a regulated state. You heard a lot about the Clean Energy Act yesterday, and how the investor-owned utilities, Dominion and AP, they are out there with RFPs looking to enter into PPAs with folks like you, like us. Different states do it differently. I'm going to keep the focus here on Virginia. And I believe that in these RFPs, Dominion and AP are holding on to the RECs themselves. Pretty sure I got that right. In another state, there might be two different off-takers for the power, or multiple off-takers for the power. Capacity is typically of interest to the ISO. And of course, you need lawyers, need people and insurers, like people on this panel, and a bunch of different documents need to make this happen. So big picture, I realize this is a somewhat busy slide, but the concept is, depending on whether or not you're using tax equity, this can determine the type of structure. And in this land of project finance, typically you have project tax equity coming in just to basically get its tax equity return. Then the developer and the tax equity investor work out their deal as to when the tax equity investor pulls out, and the process flips to where the developer owns it.
That's a good 1 minute reminder, Charlie.
1 minute. Okay, good. Thanks. Really quickly, so these last slides, not going to go through them. Here's the concept. On the liability issue, I thought I turned that guy on. The liability issue, there are ways to, in fact, get certainty. Not necessarily no liability, although you can do that with indemnities, but at least certainty. That's true at the state level, and that's true at the federal level. And it's especially true if you can have a site that, in fact, is in the safe harbor of liability from the feds. And we may cover that a little bit more in this afternoon. And I think I'm going to hold off on this slide. I'm just going to power through it. I'm going to do it again this afternoon, perhaps. And I think I'm done in time.
Okay.
Done
No, that was great. No, good job. Right on time, Charlie. Charlie, bravo. And all really important things. And again, I want to remind everybody, all Charlie's terrific slides. And I think he's actually going to have some bonus slides for us, which will be shared in the knowledge binder. That's a quick reminder too, for all of our speakers and presenters, you do have the opportunity to add those bonus slides. So you stay tuned, everybody. You're probably going to have some extra material, even on the presentations that you've already seen. And Charlie, that was a really great start. I appreciate the way that you briskly kind of went through the structure of that and helped set the table. I think that's a really great place actually to bring Mark in. I mean, this is how we drew it up. But Mark can help us kind of make it real in Virginia. I mean, this is the guy who's taken, you know, he's digging through boxes looking for old titles and taking it to the closing table. And, you know, I've seen some, Mark, I was not involved, but kind of alongside of a deal in Illinois, a town in Southern Illinois. They you know, they were gung-ho and an early adopter, and they got all the way down to the end. And wouldn't you know, the property lines weren't where they thought that it was, and about 18 months worth of due diligence on all sides was just washed down the toilet. So I hope that's a good bridge to your remarks. First, introduce yourself and tell us, you know, about your practice and how you see, you know, stepping into Virginia's moment now.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. And thanks, Charlie. Good morning. Mark Bergoffen. I'm a partner in the real estate department of Shulman Rogers. We're a full service law firm in the Metro Washington, D.C. area, and we represent clients across Maryland, D.C. and the Commonwealth of Virginia, as well as across the country, many of which are developing solar projects across the mid-Atlantic. So my day typically in the solar realm occurs, you know, so when a developer comes and they want to develop, say, a 65 megawatt project, you know, how do they go about doing that? So they need to lease or option to lease a healthy amount of acreage, and they typically acquire the substation parcel outright. And because these parcels are not contiguous or may not be contiguous to the substation, you need to negotiate easements to connect all the pieces of the puzzle together. So I'm going to speak about the unique issues in these real estate documents that are entered into in connection with utility scale solar projects. First, I'm going to talk about leases, which is the principal means by which a solar developer secures site control over land by virtue of a long-term ground lease. So how does a lease for a solar project differ from other types of leases? First, let's take a look at the term. Like all ground leases, the term's relatively long, you know, 40, maybe 50 years or even longer. And you need to sufficiently either amortize the investment that is made in the project to permit a return to the investor on the project, whether it's tax equity, like Charlie mentioned, or others, as well as satisfy any terms of a PPA that you may have. But if you need to move quickly to secure site control so that you can get your project into the PJM queue, you can't just sign a lease for a 50-year term. So, you know, if you don't decide to move forward, if you're not awarded a project, or if it's never built, you don't want to be stuck with a 50-year term. So typically the term is bifurcated or even trifurcated between a relatively short development term and a longer operations or production term. The development period is relatively short, like I said, and permits the developer really to perform their due diligence on the property and determine whether it will decide to move forward with the project in general, and whether or not the parcel in particular is going to be included in the larger project. It also allows the developer to secure any kind of required approvals, whether it's at the state or at the local level. And during this development period, the landowner usually retains the right to use and occupy the property in the same manner that they have used it previously, whether it's agricultural or hunting or timber use or what have you. But as a quick aside, I want to make note that the rents that are paid for these solar leases on the development term are relatively low, whereas the quote, the big money that is paid is usually when the project comes online during the production or operations term. But there is no guarantee that a developer will ultimately develop a project. So just because a lease is signed doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to get built, because the developer could decide not to use a particular property, could decide not to develop the project as a whole. So it should be expressly stated in the agreement, even though during the course of negotiations, the developer will speak with the landowner and advise them of that. But it's good practice to include that in the document as well, so that there is no semblance of confusion on the part of the landowner. Another quick aside is that rather than having a bifurcated lease, another way to accomplish this is to have an option to lease, where the developer would engage in the same activities during the development period, during an option period, and then just exercise the option once they decide to move forward. But back to the lease, if the developer does decide to move forward with the project, then they'll start to develop and commence construction. And then once construction is finished, the production period or operations period begins. And then usually the trigger for this is COD, which is the commercial operations date, the date that the project is connected to the grid and is online and generating electricity. Sometimes the landowner will want to make it the earlier of a hard date or COD, so that way they know that there is some outside date involved. Okay, so what are some of the other unique provisions in solar leases? So let's talk about easements. In addition to granting a lease over land, most solar leases will also separately grant easements for the benefit of the project, both temporary and future easements. And these easements include easements for ingress, egress, and access. They include transmission easements for the installation of transmission facilities to connect the electricity generated on the property to the substation, as well as an easement for the effects resulting from the operation of the project, such as audio, visual, vibration, that sort of thing. Finally, solar leases also include a negative easement for solar irradiation, also known as solar insolation. And so what this does is that it prevents the landowner from interfering with the light reaching the solar panels and places restrictions such as height limitations on structures or trees, which may abut the project, so that the project can capture the full amount of the sun. So the language in an irradiation easement is usually very broad. It will typically provide something along the lines of: tenant is granted the exclusive right to the unimpeded passage of sunlight and solar irradiation to and across the property. Owner covenants that neither owner nor any other person shall obstruct or interfere with such easement for the unimpeded passage of sunlight and solar irradiation throughout the entire area of the property where solar panels are or may be located, which shall consist of horizontally 360 degrees from each point within the property where solar panels are installed or may be located at any time or from time to time, to the boundaries of the property and vertically through all space above the surface of the property. So it's pretty comprehensive. Poetry. And on top of that,
I'm sorry, poetry.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. And then on top of that, the tenant will usually reserve the right to enforce the terms of this radiation easement through injunctive relief, meaning that they can compel the landowner to desist from engaging in certain activities that would interfere with the easement, as well as reserve self-help rights, meaning that they could cut the trees down themselves or remove buildings or what have you. The final point on easements is that tenants may reserve the right to claim future easements as needed. You know, once the due diligence is done on the project takes shape and they know what it's going to look like, they may also want to reserve, like for instance, an access road within the property or adjacent to the property or on adjacent property that's owned by the landowner that is not part of necessarily the project parcel. Okay. Next, let's talk about who owns the project and is entitled to all of the benefits. The short answer is it all belongs to the tenant. Even if the project improvements are considered fixtures in the traditional sense, the tenant owns all of the improvements and is entitled to all of the benefits that may be procured by the project. including energy tax credits, as well as the right to mortgage the project. And we'll talk about lender rights in a minute. But let's talk about taxes real quick. In the typical solar lease, the landowner pays taxes on the underlying land, and the tenant usually pays taxes for the improvements and any personal property. The tenant may also pay, and typically does pay, what's known as rollback taxes or agricultural land transfer taxes, which may be imposed when the use of the property for solar purposes or non-agricultural purposes results in a loss of the agricultural assessment. Sometimes the tenant will pay the difference between the taxes payable under the ag assessment and the reassessment for solar use. Sometimes the tenant will just pay all of the taxes. It's really subject to negotiation. Okay, so another thing that distinguishes solar leases from other commercial leases is that the landowner has limited termination rights as opposed to a typical landlord in a traditional commercial lease. Generally, there are substantial notice and cure periods before a landowner can declare a default, and then the remedies are limited, usually to damages. And it's also fairly typical to have a landowner agree to waive the right to summary ejection or other expedited possessory action. So usually the landlord has a right to go to landlord-tenant court to, quote, evict a tenant in the event that there's a default under a lease. In most solar leases, that is expressly excluded. And the reason for that is, it may seem obvious. It's because we can't have like one piece of the project taken out because of the minor type of default. It really needs to be a major default that's going to impact the project as a whole. And while the landowner will have limited default remedies, at the same time, the lender and the tenant will usually reserve the right to self-help in the event of a landowner default, and otherwise have pretty broad cure rights. So let's talk about the lender rights. Charlie was talking about different lenders and investors in these types of solar projects. Lender rights are really critical in order to help facilitate the financeability of a solar project. The typical lender will almost always be given specific notice and opportunity to cure any tenant default prior to a landowner being able to exercise any remedies against a defaulting tenant, and also allows the lender to cure the default at its option. Also, leases will make it where existing lenders on the underlying fee, so the landowner's mortgage holder will typically either subordinate or enter into some sort of agreement with the project lender to make sure that the project lender's rights are primary. So let's talk about assignment rights quickly. The party signing the lease with the landowner is very often not the party which will ultimately construct and operate the project. Not only will the developer reserve the right to assign the lease, but it's also very common for the developer to reserve the right to create separate leases or shrink the project footprint, or once a survey is completed, and then or as the project takes shape. So just because you're leasing 100 acres of a farm doesn't necessarily mean that's where it's going to end up. So as the project takes shape and as due diligence happens, then there are adjustments that are made. Also, once a survey is completed. So let's talk about what happens at the end of the typical term. In the typical ground lease, the underlying fee owner will own the improvements at the end of the term, but we talked about a second ago that the landowner doesn't have any reversionary ownership interest in the project improvements, so they will not be able to claim ownership at the end of the term. And even if they could, they really don't want to. In fact, most landowners want the solar operator to remove the project and restore the property to the condition that existed before the beginning of the lease. And they typically secure the tenant's obligation to do so by having the tenant provide some sort of decommissioning security in an amount that will cover the cost of the removal of the improvements. There was a question raised in the comments earlier that had regarding maintenance, and I'll just say real quick that the operator is motivated to maintain the panels in order to maximize the output. So they are arguably already, motivated to maintain the sites. But the decommissioning security will also help ensure that they don't just leave the project there as well. And then now real quickly, I want to talk about some Virginia-specific lease issues. Virginia no longer requires that a lease with a term of more than 5 years be in the form of a deed pursuant to the Virginia Statute of Conveyances. And that's a big deal. It used to be that leases that were 5 years or longer needed to be in the same form as a deed. That's in section 55.2 of the Virginia Code, which says that it either has to contain a seal, has to contain the word deed or indenture. That's why you see a lot of times in Virginia, you see a deed of lease, or the signatures need to be notarized. And most Virginia real estate attorneys are aware of this and draft their leases in compliance with the statute of conveyances. However, not every lease did satisfy the requirements. And in 2018, the Virginia Supreme Court held that a lease that did not comply with the statute of conveyances could be repudiated by either the landlord or the tenant. So obviously this sent shockwaves through the leasing world as parties realized that their leases were subject to cancellation without penalty. Fortunately, in 2019, the legislature came to the rescue and found that the leases remained valid even if they didn't satisfy the statute of conveyances. So thank you very much to the General Assembly. Another Virginia-specific item I wanted to note is the legal description that you include with the lease, and more particularly the memorandum of lease, which is recorded in the land records. A lot of times you'll see a general reference to a tax map or something like that, which is fine at the outset, especially because you don't have a current survey, but it's always good practice to reserve the right to amend the lease to provide for a more specific legal description once the survey is completed or once due diligence is completed. And that way you can get an updated memorandum of lease recorded. It's also important that once you get financing, in order for the documents to be to obtain title insurance, you have to have an actual legal description as opposed to a tax map reference. So that's important. And then finally, a quick note on subsurface leases. More often than not, you're not going to run into this issue except for certain portions of the Commonwealth, although I have actually dealt with a landowner who wanted to reserve your uranium rights. So who knows? But the key is you want to make sure that the subsurface rights are subordinate to the surface rights on your solar lease, and that you make sure you preserve subjacent, which is underneath, and lateral support to the side, so that way the ground is supported. Let's see, maybe just real quick to talk about purchase options. As we discussed, although site control is very often achieved by a long-term ground lease, a developer may also seek an outright purchase of the property. And rather than just doing a typical purchase agreement, they'll do an option to purchase where they'll do all of the due diligence in advance. And then once they've completed that, they will exercise the option and then go to closing. And then, the typical option will contain, for all intents and purposes, all of the provisions that you would typically find in a traditional purchase and sale agreement as well. And okay, let me, since we're a little short on time, let me just speak real briefly about easements. The one thing I do want to say about easements is to make sure that you define the easement purpose broad enough to capture all of the uses that you intend to use it for. We talked about easements that are within the project parcel, but if you've got 6, 10, 15, 20 parcels that aren't contiguous and you need to string them together, you need to have easements that connect them all together. And in doing so, make sure that you define the easement purpose broadly enough to encompass all of the activities that you want to do. So if you state that the easement is merely for ingress and egress, then you can't later on expand the use of that to include transmission lines. So please keep that in mind, that you don't what's known as overburden the easement purpose. And so try to think prospectively as to all the different types of uses that you may want. I think that's really all I had for right now. So I guess we can take questions at the end, and then we can hand it over to Chris.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, that's perfect. I love dirt, baby. That's my bag. But so does Chris. And he has done this session for us in the past, and always anchors because we love to see how he wraps things together like nobody does conceptually and very practically. So, hey, Chris, how are you today?
Good morning, Dan. How are you? Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Pretty well after 3 days of quite a solar festival, and then St. Patty's Day last night. And as you know, I'm mostly Irish and I have a lot of family here in Chicago. But I digress from that, my friend. Tell us what we're missing and how you wrap your arms around risk and package it up for purposes of PPAs.
Absolutely. So just so everybody knows, I am a true insurance geek. I have my undergraduate and graduate degree in insurance and finance from the College of Insurance, which is now part of St. John's University School of Risk Management. I don't sell personal lines. I don't sell benefits. All I do is property and casualty. And while I love the fact that I have my master's in insurance, most of my clients only care that I could solve their environmental risk issues. So I'm the practice leader at NFP Environmental. I've been here for about 2 years now. Prior to that, I was at the big boys, Marsh and Aon, Alliant. And we're rocking and rolling. I mean, we are busy. We see a lot of institutional capital coming out there and looking for a home. A lot of solar activity. You know, who would have thought that in this day and age, landfills that were once a blight on society are now very valuable pieces of land that can be repurposed. And as you say, from brownfield to butterfly. And all I want to do is make sure that my clients have that big virtual bear hug when it comes to insurance, and that we take care of their stuff. A lot of people may not know, most of my clients are capital markets people. So I am involved in the deal. First, Charlie gets the call because it's a brownfield. Then I get the call. Chris, well, what do you think? And that starts the conversation, and we work through due diligence, go to permitting, go through construction, and then go through operations. So I'm happy to bring it all together for you and try to simplify what has become a needlessly overcomplicated conversation. Because at the end of the day, there are only two ways to fund losses, either through insurance or through retained earnings. That's it. So, Kelsey, can you put my slides up?
We got you.
Yes, sir. Give me just 1 second.
There she is, one of the bright stars. While we vamp, Kelsey fought through COVID.
Exactly.
For us last week. She's a superstar. And I actually should mention Robin Ernst had COVID last week too. Our keynote speaker, if you can believe that. But we're all making do in the pandemic and shining nonetheless.
Absolutely.
Bear with us while we
I would just go back to what Charles said. I don't really think that clients can really insulate themselves from liability. I mean, there are certain protections under CERCLA, but at the end of the day, a lot of my clients are concerned that if something falls through the cracks, they want to make sure that the defense is funded, and that's why you buy insurance. And to make sure that that the insurance company is going to hire favorable counsel like Charles and Mark, and make sure that their issues get resolved properly and seamlessly. So this is me. This is my contact information. Everybody knows me. I'm pretty much out there on social media, always talking about insurance and risk. So next, these are the slides. A lot of these slides are just for information, Dan, filler, but we'll just focus on the first few. Next. It all starts with the dirt, folks. Nobody's calling me because they got a greenfield, although, you know, what is sometimes a greenfield is not always a greenfield, because data gaps in phase ones do exist at times. So when I get involved in a deal, and this is any deal, this could be a 400,000 square foot warehouse on the New Jersey Turnpike, in Chicago, in LA, in Long Beach, anywhere. These are what deals look like from an insurance and risk perspective. LOI, soft close. A client identifies a site. Chris, we got this. We're going to do a long-term ground lease. Here, it's a cap in place. We want to put solar all around. We want a large utility scale solar contract. We may need to pierce the cap. There could be potential off-site migration issues. What do we need to know? It all starts the process. We look at the agreements. We look at the lease agreements. We look at any easements or access agreements, because there's elements of risk in those too, folks. And we want to make sure that whatever insurances that the other parties are supposed to have, they have. You can't imagine how many times when I have a client in due diligence and they have when they have contractors on site, they're doing test borings. They haven't provided evidence of insurance. Why? It should be seamless. And many people may not know this, and we're going to speak a lot about counterparty risk today. Insurance is a counterparty risk. We don't always know if the insurance company is going to respond. We hope it does. We look at a certificate of insurance. We don't know what kind of claims activity is behind it. We don't know if there's any limits left, right? So then we go through due diligence. You know, the deal team, no go. Does the project pencil out, right? And the cost of the insurance from a budget perspective helps. It's typically a rounding error, but it could be a very important rounding error, folks. What does the deal look like? Who are the JV partners? What kind of liability, what kind of environmental indemnification obligations flow from the parties? Oftentimes you have a lead deal person and they bring in a JV partner. Well, the JV partner may not want to have pre-close environmental risk. We need to know that, and we can ensure that. Who are the capital funds, capital sources, source of funds, right? Commercial debt, folks. Debt drives insurance. If anybody tells you otherwise, they're being less than honest. Debt always drives the insurance. What is the use? Is it going to be a solar farm? Will it stay a solar farm, right? You can underwrite around that risk because there's obviously what's clean for a solar farm may not be clean enough for residential housing, for example. You know, how much lot coverage are we going to have, right? How are we going to address the runoff, right? We've been speaking a lot about runoff. Is that going to work? Is that going to bode well for the client? And then again, the insurance pro forma. We get the site. We know what the site is. It's a brownfield. Do we have to remediate it? Is it going to be part of the voluntary remediation program, right? Are there any incentives there? Are any grants, loans? What are the means and methods? Is it going to be a surcharge site? In the great state of New Jersey, all the sites along the Newark Bay and the Hackensack River and Passaic River, they all need to come up because they're all 8 feet or 9 feet below FEMA flood levels. Folks, there's not a lot of clean fill in New Jersey. There may be elsewhere, but there's not a lot of clean fill in New Jersey. And the problem is that if we bring fill onto a site, whether it's clean or not, it becomes our problem once that dump truck unloads it. It's insurable, folks, but it could be a very expensive mistake. You know, are we going to cap it in place? And what are the long-term monitoring requirements? Not only from a soil erosion standpoint, from a groundwater perspective. Groundwater issues create natural resource damage claims, which are very big in California and New York and New Jersey and Florida to a lesser extent. And then when due diligence ends, we're ready to close, go to financial close. We need to make sure that we have premises liability coverage because now title transferred. If anybody comes on that site, we are now on risk. It could be a trespassee, it could be an invitee, it could be anybody. We are now on risk for the liability risk. Are we going to be doing site work? Then we should think, especially on a brownfield, we should be thinking about contractors' pollution liability policy because that pays for exacerbation or creation of new pollution conditions. Exacerbation is a big risk, especially on many of the sites that I work on. PLL, title transfer. Once you own that dirt, you are now in the chain of custody, folks. So you have an obligation to indemnify and potentially defend others for damages arising from pollution conditions on at or from your site. D&O issues. A lot of people don't think about it, but let's go back to formation agreements. Let's say your partner, let's say your deal team or the deal goes south. Failing to meet financial projections is insurable under a D&O policy because it pays damages, people. I mean, it's doesn't happen a lot, thankfully, but if you miss the pro forma or you don't make the projections, you could potentially have coverage under a D&O policy. So then we go into the remedial action work plan. We're going to submit a remedial action work plan. I'm not very familiar with the West Virginia programs, but I'm sure they're kind of robust for brownfield redevelopment. Dan, can you comment on that?
West Virginia and Virginia, both super robust and both full of stars too, relative to our other states. Sorry, the other 48 states. But that's right. Whatever they're doing over there, they've got really good people in the programs. Yeah.
And there are some states in the union that do a really good job of that. Indiana, for example, New Jersey does not so well. New York is good. But I don't understand these states. The land is valuable or could be valuable. So why wouldn't we invest in bringing it back and creating ratables? Because all these states are scrambling for ratables. Doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me. But what do I know? We're going to receive an NFA. You're going to go to equivalent and construction insurance. The EPC contract, the EPC. Who's going to handle the builder's risk? Who's going to insure the equipment that comes on site? And what about the liability? We have to remember that not only do we have liability while the site is getting built, but there's completed operations exposure there, folks. And that runs to New Jersey's 10 years. I think West Virginia is probably 6 or 8 years from the time you get CL, from the time you turn over the keys. And then we go vertical. Then you make sure that the insurance is in place. We start construction, and then you get this. We move to CL. Pre-close versus post-close, folks. The liabilities, they're fluid, but they're different. Make sense, Dan?
Perfect sense. I've heard you give this speech many times before, but it's interesting. It's just as interesting to me every time.
Wonderful.
Well, this is the first time I've seen this picture. The hands coming out of the brownfields.
Yeah. Night of the Living Dead. But you like the butterfly? Do you like the butterfly?
Beautiful. Yeah. You definitely upgraded your presentations for us this time.
I did. Well, I can't take much credit for that. That's our graphic arts team at NFP. I got to give them some props because
it takes a team.
I'm artistically challenged.
We've learned that it takes a team, and that's perfect. All right, you want to say one more thought before we roll into just kind of questions? Go ahead.
No, I think that there needs to be a paradigm shift on the way people think about insurance. I think oftentimes we allow ourselves to get caught up in the commoditization of risk, and we're only looking at insurance and risk from an expense perspective. I think if we look at risk from insurance from an asset perspective, the ability to assign these policies, the ability to leverage the PLL policies and the CPL policy, the ability to get basis points relief if we use insurance as a backstop to a power purchase agreement, for example, right? The ability to satisfy the lender's needs by including them on a PLL policy and potentially getting basis points relief from that. The ability to think differently and understand that while insurance is a very small part of the equation, it is, in my opinion, the most critical part. And one thing I've really learned and embraced that during the time of COVID, when the world goes to hell, people buy more insurance. And and it's very good for me. I mean, personally speaking, but it's think differently, folks. Don't allow yourself just to use a broker or to use an advisor that is just trying to focus on the immediate need and the most obvious want. There's far more that needs to be done when you look at, especially on project finance and utility scale solar projects.
That's perfect. Thanks, Chris. It keeps coming up again and again. You've got to have a team of professionals. They have to be capable and qualified to be able to do this stuff. And you got to start early. You can't wait to the big reveal at the closing table to be dropping any bombs on anybody.
Absolutely.
Especially with this stuff. It's the degree of difficulty is just higher, as we've seen, kind of from every layer on this solar redevelopment cake. You just can't fake the funk on this dunk. You've got to do it right from the start. And I want to underscore, as a totally disinterested third party, here too, insurance can save us. It's all, we've been seeing the effectiveness of this in brownfield redevelopment deals for many decades now. Virginia and DMME, there's a bill on the governor's desk right now to set up a kind of parallel Brightfield grant program similar to US EPA. And Virginia's already a hot solar market, so it's they're really going to be leading in, and as they go fast and furious to scale up from here, a little bit of insurance is going to go a long way, because mistakes are inevitable and Mother Nature is angry, as you learned after Hurricane Sandy. I appreciate the fact that you worked in the fact. After Sandy, FEMA raised the floodplain requirements, and we're looking for feet and cubic feet of clean fill. And I think that's a story that we're going to start to see play out in geographies around the country.
FEMA has raised the floodplain requirements 9 times since Sandy. Whew. And that's the challenge that many of my clients that are doing last mile work along the New Jersey Turnpike are dealing with.
Right. So, the hopes and the opportunities are greater than ever in the Renaissance, but you know what? So are our challenges. We're going to need all this technology and all this know-how. So, Mark, let me bring you back into the conversation. We had a specific question about lease. I want to try to get to as many questions as we can, but before I do that, I want to officially announce our soft break. So if you don't want to hang on for a few questions and dive deep with these guys, you can come back later in the afternoon. We're doing the end of the day Q&A wrap, but right now we're just going to take a few questions, stand up, go get a cup of coffee, walk the dog, come back at the top of the hour, 6 minutes from now, and we're going to roll over with Mr. Jonathan Sweet, who you may know as one of Virginia's many municipal level stars, public sector stars, and they've got an incredible project they're going to turn in. Now, Mark, let me bring you back in on leases and get you this question. Do leases typically allow a landowner to back out or renegotiate payments of the long-term lease during the option period, perhaps because of changing economic conditions, for example?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And John, thanks for your question. So generally speaking, in my experience, the economics of the deal, including the rent and the production term rent, are going to be negotiated on the front end And they'll provide for escalations over time, whether it escalates, every 5 years, every 10 years, or, year over year. But typically the economics are negotiated in advance. Very rarely, and when I, not too often, although I have seen it, where the landowner did reserve the right to revisit the rent payable after a particular period in time. And it's not unlike a typical commercial lease where there's some mechanism for figuring out what fair market value is for the rent. But more often than not, in my experience, those terms are set in at the outset.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Chris, a question for you coming back in on insurance and kind of getting super practical because, environmental insurance is its own kind of unique market, sometimes a dark market, and you work with market makers all the time. So the question is, how available is environmental insurance policies right now? Insurance is a great tool, but only if you can get it. Are there projects, conditions, and risks that insurance will not likely cover?
To the extent that you have a brownfield redevelopment project, I spend most time focusing in on the contract rather than focusing on the dirt. And I want to understand better than what the insurance company understands the amount of risk that you're assuming. So risk ebbs and flows, right? And we will make sure that everything, all the liabilities that you assume under contract are transferred to the insurance company. To the extent they're not, you're gonna quantify that. We're gonna put that in the box. So to answer your question, that's a great question. Commercial insurance market is in complete disruption. Property liability, excess, nightmare, cyber. But what happens is the PLL market has not seen the hardening that the other lines of insurance have yet. It's starting to retrench, in my opinion. There are 40 insurance companies or so that write PLL. I write most of my business with 5 or 6. One thing people need to realize that Munich Re, which is the largest reinsurer in the world, writes 60% of the reinsurance for the global PLL market. So as long as Munich Re is involved, all good. If Munich Re is not involved, I got to find another hobby. But market is robust. Make sure that your broker that's placing your auto policy is probably not placing your PLL policy because they're 2 separate things. Right. And there's a lot, we stretch and we push the market harder than anybody to make sure that the coverage is there for, it parallels your risk in the deal. Lastly, folks, these PLL policies are assignable. They become an asset to a deal. So while you may take some pain in the beginning, you're going to realize some consideration when you go to flip the asset. So robust market, challenging market. But if you work with a knowledgeable pollution broker, there's a difference. You should have a resounding success in the market.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, you can get a price, just price discovery, but you have to do your due diligence. You've got to figure it out. You've got to start to delineate and objectify, your project so you can go and get the, questions that you can bank on.
Yeah, and then lastly, what I do is when clients come to me and they're looking at a site, I'm going to tell them what I think the insurance is going to cost and conceptually how it will be structured before I even go out to the market, because I want to make sure I control the transaction. I'm not going to trust an underwriter to tell me what they think, because honestly, who cares what they think? I'm going to lead that. I'm going to lead the deal. I'm going to
awesome. Lead. Well, thanks, Chris. Charlie, final word to you. And I'm particularly interested, from your federal experience and the work that you're doing now, FERC and policy changes, could you give us just a very brief perspective on the kind of electricity landscape, maybe, and maybe that's top down.
Yeah.
What can we expect?
So I may hit this afternoon, but here's the key thing I want to say, which I think is important. 2222. FERC Order 2222 issued last fall requires all ISOs, RTOs, provision, that's PJM, to develop plans whereby distributed resources across the board, both demand response and distributed generation, can bid into wholesale, the PJM market more clearly. The still not a lot of money to be made there. That's why net metering is more attractive typically, but you're going to see even more movement whereby there's going to be new businesses coming out there that may be interested in putting together 3 or 4 maybe smaller solar farms that wouldn't have previously been bankable, that now is of interest to FERC. Second point, location. Where you interconnect. I don't think any of the projects that we're talking about in this conference are going to interconnect on the transmission line unless they're really huge and they don't need this conference. Most of us are going to be interconnecting on the distribution line, and you have to deal with the local utility, even though you may be selling a product into the wholesale market. So stay tuned this afternoon. We may get to more of that, but bottom line is that the dividing line between distribution and transmission, between wholesale and retail, has never been sort of more amorphous, with the Supreme Court upholding the authority of FERC to open up wholesale markets to participation by folks who, in a sense, are looking like they're retail. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Charlie. It's a perfect way to wrap, kind of a stay tuned. And we will. I want to thank Charlie, Mark, and Chris for getting up early with us and lending us their big brains, especially on some of these very tricky Brightfield issues. And I'm also happy to say that I think they're all coming back for the Q&A expert session today. Although I'm not sure about Mark, he might have had something else going on. But some of the questions we couldn't get to, we're going to try to address in today's big Q&A wrap. These guys are dialed in early. They'll be dialed in late. They're doing this stuff all the time, eating the Renaissance for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So thank you, guys. Really appreciate it.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.